Yes.
So we are turning to the data across this period. Before I do so, there are just a couple of things to pick up from yesterday. We looked at the Trends Working Group from 1977 yesterday, and you'll recall that I showed you the second draft and said that that was the latest document that I had found. I have helpfully been told by the inquiry legal team that we do have the final report. If we could have, please, on screen, DHSC 301318. This, as you will see, is the report of the working group on trends in the demand for blood products. Yesterday's document had in the top right-hand corner second draft, and I think the date was sometime in October. If we could go to the last page of that document, please, Paul. We can see in the bottom left, December 1977. So that is the final draft. I'm happy to say that, save for a couple of typographical changes, there's no difference in substance between those bits that I read out yesterday and this document.
Thank you.
There's also a document that I'd like to take you to, which is DHSC 0103249_096. This is a document we can see in the bottom right-hand corner is written August 1977. And it says the National Blood Transfusion Service, the relationship of demand and supply of the main blood products. What I interpret this to be is a working document, possibly as part of a Trends working group, because we can see that figure next to albumin, 200 grams per 1,000 of population, which is the estimated level of demand over the next 5 to 10 years. That's the type of work that the Trends Working Group were doing, and that is the figure that the Trends Working Group arrive at. For factor 8, the figure is given of 50 million international units. And then on the right-hand side, and the reason that I'm taking you to this document, is current rate of supply, and it says 17.5 million international units NHS freeze-dried concentrate. You said yesterday, sir, that you had seen the figure of 17.5 million international units somewhere. I wonder if it may be from this document or from around this time, but it ties in with Dr. Wolford's report of Dr. Lane's talk. Now, the 17.5 million international units there is expressed as NHS freeze-dried concentrate. The most logical way to interpret that is 17.5 million international units from BPL, PFL, and PFC together.
Well, that's difficult, because if you go to the left, we have 50 million international units. It's the National Blood Transfusion Service, which isn't the National Blood Transfusion Service in terms of
That's
UK.
True.
It's England and Wales, which we know. And 50 million, it approximates, I think, roughly, I suppose, same words, but it's pretty much 1 unit per person in the country.
Yes.
And that's the observation I made yesterday.
For England and Wales, yes.
For England and Wales.
Yes.
But not for the country as a whole, if the country is the UK.
That's right. That's right. There is, therefore, a difficulty in trying to interpret all of this.
So you may be right, but you may not be.
Exactly. And it may or may not then be related to the 17 million that Dr. Wolford noted Dr. Lane saying was the BPL maximum production.
It would be odd if it were the total UK production, because what you were telling me yesterday was that it was thought that there was 15 million available capacity-wise from BPL and 15 million capacity-wise at least from PFC. Do you not tell me that?
I think that was 15 million factor concentrate. I think the reference was 15 million factor concentrate, 15 million cryoprecipitate across the UK. I don't know. I'm
Right.
afraid I can't assist with PFC values. Mr. Buchra next week may be able to. I'll just turn to Mr. Terry. Very approximately, and this will be something picked up next week, the figure for PFC at around this time is somewhere in the region of between 1.7 and 2 million. So if you added back to
between what? Between
1.7 and 2 million of international units. If that were added to the 15 million from a BPL,
well, in
that would take
1977.
7.5. So,
After PFC's got up and running. PFL I can understand, but PFC.
I may be confusing PFL and PFC there. I think I will have to stop, sir, and we'll have to look at those figures, and you'll get the figures from Scotland next week.
Yes. Just looking back at my quick notes of what you were saying. Yes, well, I'd have to check back the actual words, I think, but it's you may well be right.
If it's a reference to what Mr. Moyle, the Secretary of State, said in Parliament in 1978, he said there that BPL and PFL produced approximately 15 million international units of concentrate. The total usage of Factor 8 in England and Wales was estimated to be approximately 45 million international units, suggesting a shortfall of 15 million because 15 million was produced by cryoprecipitate. But he was careful to give the figures only for England and Wales, and he referred questions about Scotland to the Secretary of State for Scotland.
Yes, I have a note that you told me that in 1976, the reference is CBLA 40391 at page 14.
Could you bring that up, please, Paul?
Or sorry, I may have got it the wrong reference, but I think I think it is page 14. CBLA 40391. Obviously, that's wrong. We'll come back to it.
I can check and we'll look into that. But there will be discussion next week about how much PFC was able to produce at this time.
Yes, thanks.
But the wider point, which I think that helpfully takes us to, is that the figure from the Trends Working Group, as you said, sir, it's expressed by head of population. And that will mean different things if you're looking at the UK than if you're looking at England and Wales. And it will also mean different things as the population changes over time. And the Trends Working Group was expressly invited to consider usage over 5 to 10 years. So while Dr. Lane put that figure of 60 million on it, and Dr. Wolford put the figure of 74 million on the amount that would be achieved if the full amount of albumin was achieved. I think it is fair to say that in both instances, those are figures for the UK based upon assumptions made about the size of the population. And Dr. Lane's assumption is 60 million. And from the maths, I think that Dr. Wolford's is somewhere in the region of 56 to 57 million. So there isn't one single figure that can be used there. And with that in mind, I should point out that in Appendix 1 of the written presentation, the figure that is used for the Trends Working Group estimate is 50 million international units, because that paper is predominantly concerned with England and Wales. And as you say, so 50 million is the approximate population size of England and Wales at that time. But as we have discussed, different figures can be drawn from it depending upon whether or not you are measuring the UK or just England and Wales. And so it should be treated as an approximation of what they were saying. But that 50 million figure is a figure which crops up in other estimates of the time, and that is all explored in Appendix 1. I'm going to begin our look across this period with estimates. And I'm not going to go through the detail that is contained in Appendix 1, but there are many other papers and meetings that are cited in Appendix 1 where estimates for future usage are made, and one can look at those in greater detail at leisure. But for the purposes of today, I have drawn up a table, and it's at INQY 40342, which is a selection of some of the estimates that are made. And it comes with the caveats that are written out at the top there, and the same caveats that we have discussed across the board. That firstly, it involves a degree of selection of which estimates one chooses. And this is my selection, and others may have others. But these seem to me to be some of the central estimates that were made over the relevant times. It needs to be remembered that not all of these estimates are necessarily attempts to come to the same, or an attempt to come to a figure for the same thing as the next estimate. So somebody is thinking about an estimate for the UK as a whole in the mid-70s. Somebody else is thinking about an estimate for England in the mid-80s. So it's not comparing like with like across the board. There is also a degree of translation, such as we've just discussed, about how you get to the figure, 50 or 60 million, for example, for the Trends Working Group. So this is an approximation. But we can see that there is an upward trend in the estimates that are being made. In March 1973, Dr. Biggs's paper to the expert group, the estimate expressed in donations is 400,000 to 750,000 donations. And we've discussed what that is an estimate of, which is treatment on demand, major surgery, and dental extractions. Similar metric for the MRC paper from January 1974. That estimate is 38 million to 53 million international units, or expressed as 547,540 donations. Dr. Bidwell's paper from January 1976 gives an estimate which is not that far off the MRC estimate for usage, 36 to 45 million international units, but is a significant increase when expressed as donations. And that's the point that we were discussing yesterday, that Dr. Bidwell made different assumptions about yield, and Dr. Lane thought that Dr. Bidwell's assumptions were more realistic. So even though she is thinking in the same ballpark as the MRC, she thinks that there have to be more donations in order to get there. Then there is the expert group on the treatment of haemophilia from May 1976, and we looked at that meeting yesterday. It agreed that the previous so-called target of the DHSS, the expansion to about 275,000 donations and then up to 340,000 donations, they decided that was outmoded. They didn't set a new target, but the figures of 35 to 40 million international units were mentioned in the discussion. So again, within the same broad ballpark as Dr. Bidwell and the MRC. And you'll remember that Dr. Biggs at that meeting expressed herself forcefully and about other meetings that she had always said that the target was around there, and she didn't really understand where a 15 million international unit target had come from. We move on to the meeting in October 1977 between representatives of the DHSS and the BPL, the beginnings of the stopgap programme. That meeting referred to a target figure of 50 million international units. It wasn't expressly said at that meeting that that would result in self-sufficiency. That is talking about a target for redevelopment, which may or may not be related to the next figure, which is the Trends Working Group, and that is the 50 to 60 million figure, so one per unit of population, for factor rate assessed need, and the 74 million figure is the figure that is reached by Dr. Wolford by saying, well, if they achieved the targets that they had set for albumin, that is how much factor rate would have been produced. But that is not the assessed need by the Trends Working Group at that time. That's December 1977. We can see in the table that there is a significant upgrade of the estimate by March 1979. That is a reference to the Scientific and Technical Committee discussion that we looked at yesterday, where the figure of 100 million is identified. I think it was expressed in the terms of if clinicians had free rein to prescribe what they wished to prescribe, then the figure could reach around 100 million international units. Dr. Lane went away and wrote a paper on the redevelopment of BPL following that meeting. And the figures that he used were 90 million international units by the mid-1980s and 120 million international units as the ceiling figure of BPL, as we discussed earlier. Not necessarily a statement that it will reach that level of demand, but that's where he thinks the planning of the plant should be. So by 1979, we are in the region of about 100 million international units. Again, there is a lack of clarity about whether or not those of the Scientific and Technical Committee were discussing just England and Wales, or whether or not they were talking about the UK as a whole. The remit of the Scientific and Technical Committee were the central blood laboratories, which were the English and Welsh central blood laboratories. So it may be that that was the focus of their attention. Certainly, Dr. Lane's paper is about what BPL needs to produce for England and Wales, not the UK as a whole. So the broad trend that we can see there is from the period circa 1974 to circa 1977, the estimates are in the region of 40 to 50 million international units, perhaps going as high as 60 million for the Trends Working Group, if one looks at the UK as a whole, with a slight population growth going through the 70s and 80s. And then a significant increase in the estimates in 1979, going up to the region of 100 million international units, and trying to project forward demand in the 80s. With that in mind, could we go please to INQY 40336. And page 41, please. This is Appendix 1 of the inquiry legal team's presentation. And if we could expand that graph, please. Earlier today, sir, I showed you the black and white graph that was part of the UK Haemophilia Centre Director's returns from 1990. This is simply a transposition of that graph into a form that we think is perhaps a little more helpful for us here. And we can see the different lines that are shown on it. This is actual consumption of factor 8 according to those annual returns from the late 60s to 1990. We can see the different lines that are on this graph. The yellow line is the total consumption of factor 8 products, and that includes concentrates and cryoprecipitate. It probably also includes plasma, but it's such a small figure it wouldn't make that much of a difference. But that is concentrate plus cryo, essentially. The green line is the total consumption without cryoprecipitate, so essentially concentrates. The red line is the amount of commercial factor 8 that is being consumed. The blue line is the amount of NHS factor 8. And it is a UK-based table, not just England and Wales. Important to stress that the conversation that I'm about to have with you is about England and Wales, and Scotland is separate and distinct and will be referred to next week. This table, which is, we think, the best single guide to consumption, is for the UK as a whole. So one must bear in mind that it doesn't precisely tally with England and Wales. What we can see from that table, just as a general point, is that in the period up until 1975 and then going on into the 76, 77, 78, there is a significant gap between the total including cryoprecipitate and the total without cryoprecipitate, so the yellow and the green lines. So we can see that cryoprecipitate is making up a significant proportion of the amount of factor 8 treatment in that time, but those lines get closer together during the late 70s, and the amount of cryoprecipitate thereafter is minimal, and the lines gradually converge in the later 80s, showing that cryoprecipitate is no longer making up a significant contribution to factor 8 treatment in the UK. The commercial factor 8 line starts low in the late 60s and early 1970s, barely featuring at all, picks up from the period after 1973, after the product licenses are issued to haemophilin and cryobuline, and then rises significantly in the 70s and into the 80s. It falls back a little in 83 and 84. Part of the reason for that would appear to be that NHS product has increased at that time. Part of the reason may also be to do with concerns about AIDS. Then commercial product picks up again in the period 84 to 85. What is not shown on the graph is the fact that this is the period in which heat-treated commercial product becomes available. And then it continues at a significantly higher rate of usage than NHS factor 8, until about 1987, where the two cross over and there is a sharp increase in NHS factor rate. We'll come back to that in a second. And because of the increase in NHS factor rate...
That's not 87, is it? It's 88.
Sorry, 88. You're right, sir. Yes, 88. A sharp increase in NHS production in 88 and a linked decline in commercial factor rate usage at that time. So I said NHS production, I should have said NHS usage, obviously linked to NHS production. Now, on that bottom line, the NHS factor rate, we can see, again, a small contribution in the early 70s, a rise between 1975 and 1978. That was a rise that was associated with the investment of £500,000 of direct central funding. Then there is a plateauing effect from 1978, 1979, and 1980, and then a rise from 1981, about stable in 82, and then a rise 83 and 84. And that, in our assessment, is linked with the investment in the stopgap programme.
I think what's confusing a little bit about the graph, possibly, is the way in which the dots, which presumably the dots correspond to years,
Yes.
don't entirely fit within the boxes, because the boxes are, between 80 and 85, for instance, there are 3 boxes, but there are 5 years.
Yes.
And so you really have to look at each dot and say that's a year.
Yes, that's right. The dots are years. There are a number of caveats which I'm going to come to in a second, but one of them is that although we have sought to enter those data points as years, the sources from which we have obtained the data aren't consistent. Yeah. So it doesn't always say between what we would have liked is a single data set which said between the 1st of January 1983 and the 31st of December 1983, 50 million international units were used. From the 1st of January 1984 to the 31st of January 1984, 55 million. And that would have made it easy to plot. Unfortunately, what we have is a series of different data points for England and Wales, which we have to try to put together. And even in the 1980s, when they become more standardised in BPL annual reports, to the intense frustration of your legal team, even those reports don't cover the same period. So the first BPL annual report is done for a financial year. Then there is a report which covers a 21-month period, presumably to tie in with the CBLA taking over responsibility. Then there is a report which covers a calendar year, and then there is a report which goes back to a financial year. So although we have plotted these as best we can year by year, they don't necessarily show precisely how much was done in that year. So it is a graph which is indicative and can show a general trend, but I don't think that one can go to a point and say, right, that means that that is precisely how much was provided in that year. But the trend that we can discern is that rise between about 75 and 78, which is associated with the investment of £500,000. The rise in the early 80s, which is associated with the stopgap programme and the investment that was made then. And then, as we can see from in the later 1980s, 1987, 1988 and onwards, there is a significant rise in production, and that is connected with the investment that was made in redeveloping BPL.
Well, you say significant rise of production. This is a consumption chart.
Quite sorry, my mistake. Significant rise in NHS, the usage of NHS factor rate, which we interpret as being linked to the significant rise in production that is a result of the redevelopment of BPL. So when those investments are made, usage of NHS factor products increases, and the association that the inquiry legal team have made is that is connected with the increases in production that result from that investment.
What is interesting in the light of what you were telling me earlier about the yield of factor VIII once it was heat treated being less than the yield which it had been, and the letter which went round to haemophilia centre directors saying you can expect 50 to 60% only of what you had before because we're now heat treating it, is that although there is the drop you might expect on this indicative chart in 1985, it doesn't seem to affect the overall consumption measured in terms of actual units delivered.
Perhaps that might be in terms of commercial and
in terms
NHS.
of just the NHS.
Yeah.
So looking at the NHS, the blue line, one way or the other, there has been a production effort, presumably because you can't obviously consume what hasn't been produced, which produces enough by way of international units despite the loss of yield, whatever the loss of yield is, involved in heat treatment.
There is, as you said, certainly the decline between 84 and 85, as shown on the graph with all the caveats I've just said, and then a modest recovery, but still below the levels before. There is an increase in commercial at the same time, and then the redevelopment of BPL. I wonder, actually, if we go to the following page, the bar chart may assist on that as well.
I mean, it may reflect, what I'm saying is this may reflect a difference of production, the increase of production over that period of time, despite the difficulties of yield.
We're going to come to some actual figures in a little bit. Perhaps I'll leave it until then, and we can pick up the conversation when we have the actual figures in front of us. I think that may be a little easier. If we could go back, Paul, to the previous graph then, please, on page 41. Thank you. This is page 41. Thank you. Tying this in with estimates, and again with caveats about the dangers of trying to draw too precise a figure from a particular data point. The lower end of Dr. Biggs's estimate from the early 1970s was 32 million international units, if one translates donations in that way, or the MRC paper puts it at 38 million international units. If we look at where 40 million international units is on the graph, and then we travel across, we can see that that is surpassed in terms of total usage, including cryoprecipitate, the yellow line, by 1976, 1977. Yeah, somewhere around there. Prior to 1979, the highest of the estimates that we looked at there was the region of 50 to 60 million. And if we go across, if we take the higher end of that, the 60 million, and we work across, we can see that that figure of 60 million is surpassed in 1980, 1981, somewhere around there, the early 80s. Remember, the trends working group was there to try to calculate trends for the next 5 to 10 years. If one takes the figure to be 50 million, then obviously it's surpassed slightly earlier. The third set of figures that we looked at was that or range of estimates was that range around 90 million to 100 million. And if we take the line up to 100 million, we can see that in 1990, total usage is around 100 million. But during that period of the 1980s, it is below 100 million. And Dr. Lane's 90 million estimate, we don't have the precise line across, but we can see he was talking about 90 million by the mid-1980s. And that seems to be a fairly robust estimate in terms of how things panned out. So we can take from that the estimates prepared in the mid-1970s may have established immediate and short-term usage, or were reasonable estimates of medium and short-term usage, but were not as robust in terms of longer-term usage. From 1979, however, you have estimates that are more robust in terms of longer-term usage. I don't make any judgment on that. That is merely an observation based on the data. Obviously, there are a wide range of matters that you will need to consider about why that was so, the change in treatments, the greater use of prophylaxis, and so forth. But that is the conclusion that we draw from the data, and we leave all other matters to submissions for others and to your judgment. That's all I will say about estimates at the moment. In terms of plasma supply and concentrate production, we've discussed many of the caveats that are involved over the last 2 days, and I won't repeat all of that discussion. The central issue is the one that I've just raised, that there isn't a single data set for each of the measures that we are looking at. There are a range of figures that could be selected, and there is a need to exercise judgment in choosing which one. A different selection, excuse me, a different selection to the one that we have made could reasonably be made by others. And we don't dispute that for a moment. Even when figures are selected, there must sometimes be assumptions made by the inquiry legal team in order to get to a usable figure. So, for example, if you are given a weekly figure for how much plasma BPL was fractioning per week, that needs to be translated to an annual figure in order to fit within our graph. And the assumption there is a 48-week year. Excuse me. Similarly, sometimes output is expressed as 10,000 vials of factor 8 were sent out. The assumption that the inquiry legal team have made is that unless it is otherwise stated, it is assumed that each vial had 250 international units within it. Now, the reason for those assumptions are because those are the figures that we find elsewhere in the documents. And so there is a reason why we have adopted them when making our calculations. But they are nonetheless assumptions, and so that is a warning which attaches to much of this data. We discussed yesterday as well using 1 litre for 1 kilogram. That is not an exact conversion, but it is one that has been adopted because it is adopted elsewhere in the papers that we have seen. When looking at the figures, the inquiry legal team have tried to use primary sources wherever they can, so the documents from the time. That hasn't always been possible, and sometimes there are gaps in the data. At other points, secondary sources have been used, and there's one in particular that I would refer you to, which is Appendix 4 of Dr. Lane's draft proof of evidence. And if we could go, please, to CBLA 607_023. We gain some understanding about how this was put together. These are instructions to counsel in the HIV haemophilia litigation. They're actually sent to Richard Price by Clifford Chance, the solicitors who were acting for the CBLA. If we could turn, please, to page 3, into paragraph 4. What is written by Clifford Chance to Mr. Price is this. Counsel has referred to Bundle H, which contains the appendices to Dr. Lane's proof. This is Dr. Lane's fourth draft proof of evidence. The information in the appendices has been compiled from documentation comprising the CBLA's discovery. I pause there to translate from legalese. So the CBLA have gone through their papers as part of the litigation, preparing them to be disclosed where appropriate to the other parties. And while they have been doing that, they've pulled together the figures which go into Appendix 4. And those are figures which cover things like the plasma provided to BPL in a given year, the amount of product that BPL is issuing in a given year, the amount of plasma that BPL is fractionating in a given year, and the nominal capacity for BPL in a given year. When I say BPL there, sir, I'm afraid I'm using it slightly lazily, meaning BPL and PFL, usually. Going back to the instructions, they say this. The figures have been obtained from a variety of sources, and in a number of cases, the figures for a particular year are inconsistent. Definitive figures for plasma production, concentrate produced by BPL and PFL, and concentrate consumed in England and Wales have been obtained from a combination of BPL, PFL records and haemophilia centre directors' returns. The other figures, however, are included because they illustrate the considerable difficulties which appeared to exist in the 1970s in producing and agreeing reliable statistics and estimates. Part 1 of Appendix 4 relates to Factor 8, and Part 2 applies to Factor 9. Counsel may consider that the figures for Factor 9 are not helpful, as self-sufficiency in Factor 9 is not an issue. Instructing solicitors have it in mind to produce a column chart to present these various figures in a way which is logical and helpful, but we would welcome Counsel's comments on this exercise. So this is from 1990. They faced the same problems that we have faced. They put together Appendix 4, trying to draw on the information that they had available to them at that time, not all of which we have necessarily been able to identify. And that is why the figures are given in the way that they are in Appendix 4, but they come with the health warning that is issued there, and which we repeat today as well. We think it's a useful source, but of course it comes with caveats. Even where we do have figures or figures from primary sources, it's not always clear what those figures are referring to. Do they refer to both BPL and PFL or just BPL? Are they England and Wales, or are they the UK? A reference to plasma being provided to BPL, is that a reference to plasma generally or to fresh frozen plasma for fractionation into Factor 8? It's not always easy to discern what those figures are, and sometimes assumptions have had to be made. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in light of all of those caveats, the figures don't always correlate. There are sometimes discrepancies, and we have tried to work out if there is a reason for the discrepancy that is substantive. In other words, is there something that was happening at BPL which explains why its total capacity was higher or was increasing while the plasma fractionation capacity remained the same? Was there something going on that explains that? Or is this just a quirk of the data that we have? And again, we'll look at that in a few examples in a second. It's not always clear. I've mentioned the difficulties about the BPL annual reports and the periods that they cover. So we can't be quite sure, particularly in the periods between about 1982 and 1984, whether what is being referred to is for a 12-month period or for the longer or shorter period of that report. The short point from all of this is the one that I've made. These figures help to discern general trends, but we should be careful not to read a false precision into them. With all of those caveats, could we go, please, to INQ 40337, page 38. This is from Appendix 2, which is the appendix on BPL, PFL capacity, production, and plasma supply. And this is the annex to the appendix, which shows a table setting out different measures. The first column is the year that that row is concerned with, starting in 1973 and going up to 1988 to 1989. The second column is FFP received, fresh frozen plasma received. That is a figure for the amount of fresh frozen plasma received at both BPL and PFL collectively.
Can I just ask, and this may be yet another uncertainty, so far as the year is concerned, does that coincide with the chronological year or the financial year or the year for returns to UKHCDO or what?
It is, for the first part, it is, as best we can understand, a calendar year. But later, you will see in the table that there is reference to 86 to 87, and that is the financial year because we are using the BPL records there as our best source. But as you say, sir, it is an uncertainty. We cannot be sure all of the time that that is referring to the calendar year. And there are inevitably gaps, particularly between 1984 and we see the BPL report. It's for a calendar year for 1984, and then for financial year 1985 to 1986. So in essence, we're not sure what happened in the first quarter of 1985 because that's not necessarily captured by either report. It's the kind of thing that had an inquiry been held in the early 1990s, one could ask questions of the witnesses who put together the reports, and we might be able to bottom this out. But at this period in time, it's not possible to do so. So the first column is fresh frozen plasma received by the two fractionation plants. The second column is the fresh frozen plasma that was fractionated by those two different plants. The third column is the annual plasma capacity. The fourth column is the annual capacity measured in international units. So two different ways of measuring how much the plants are capable of producing. One is by measuring how much plasma it can fractionate.
Well, it is the capacity is dealing with. I just want to understand the word capacity really, because from what we understand from various sources, the question is not just how much the production bit of the production premises can make. It also has to bring into the warehouse the plasma in the first place and keep it in a warehouse before it's distributed at the end. So you've got the freezer area, presumably, if it's fresh frozen plasma at the start. You have to then do whatever you do to make it, which is that's that process. And then at the end, you've got the product, which presumably, so far as factor 8 is concerned, is going to be a freeze-dried product. But two questions. When it deals with annual plasma capacity, is it dealing with the whole amount of plasma brought in for all purposes, such as albumin, etc., immunoglobulins, as well as factor VIII? And is it referring to the capacity of the plant overall to handle this much in a year, which would involve all three elements that I've just mentioned, warehousing the raw material, warehousing the finished material, and the production in the middle? Or does it mean something different when you come to international units, when you may be talking, because plainly international units relates to a product, you're relating it specifically to factor VIII?
Yes, well, to deal with the last point first, the fourth column is annual plasma capacity, so how much is being fractionated. The fifth column
That's fractionated for all purposes or just for factor VIII?
I'll come back to that in a moment, sir. The fifth column is annual capacity as measured by international units, and that is how much of the factor VIII is going out as measured by international units. So that is a fairly clear metric, and we know that relates to factor VIII, and we are able to say that is, in effect, what the factories are putting out. The fourth column, as you've said, sir, that's less certain, because that is about how much plasma is being fractionated, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of that is going to go out of the gate for the reasons that you have given. Our best understanding is that these figures relate to fresh frozen plasma that is being fractionated for the purposes of producing factor VIII. But we cannot always be sure that that is right. The attempt is to try to present a table that is relevant to factor VIII rather than to the other blood products. But as you've implied, sir, we can't always be sure.
It may be that there's no real difference, except for plasma which is time expired, in terms of annual plasma capacity, because the fractionation process would start off, would it not, with factor VIII and then move on to factor IX and then
Yes.
work through the various steps and end up with albumin and immunoglobulin?
That's right, sir. But
from the same
yes.
same liter of plasma.
But the time expired plasma is the problem.
Yes.
That's the grit in the oyster. We have sought to identify the figures for fresh frozen plasma, but we can't always be sure that the figure that we have got is just fresh frozen plasma. It becomes clearer as time progresses, but the figures from the early 70s are difficult, and you will see there actually that there are gaps in that table because we just haven't been able to identify that figure. But the second point that you made, sir, is again another important caveat, that just because you have fractionated the plasma doesn't mean that you have necessarily issued the factor VIII. It could be sitting in a warehouse somewhere. If we look at, firstly, the period 1973 to 1977, I should say that there are footnotes there, and for each of these figures there is a source which is referred to and can be looked at and checked, and I stress that there are other sources available as well. If we go back to the table, please, Paul. If we look first at the plasma supply, so the FFP received, in 1973, 4,628 litres. We could go over to the next page, please. We have 2 years where we don't have data. And then 1976, 46,500 kilograms. 77, around 64,000 kilograms. 78, 76,000 kilograms. And 79, 77,000 kilograms. We can see, therefore, the plasma supply increasing in that period between 1973 and 1978. The increase lessens between 1977 and 1978. We heard a little about that yesterday, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the increase is related, in our assessment, to the £500,000 of special allocation funding. We can also see, if we go back, please, Paul, that if we go back to the previous page, and the column for the amount of Factor 8 issued, so the last column, in 1973, 2.6 million international units, 1974, 2.7, 1975, it drops down to 2.1, but then over the page onto 1976, 1977 and 1978, we can see that it increases to 6.1 million international units, then 11.5 million international units, then 14 million international units by 1978, which is approaching the capacity of the plant as then expressed in international units, which is 15 million international units. And again,
just so coming back to the point about the differential use of the word capacity, if capacity means the ability to handle, how much can you take before you start overflowing, if you like, then I can understand that's exactly why you've got 15 million international units in the second from right column. But the third from right is the capacity, plasma capacity, and that's the amount of plasma you can handle. Why should that differ at all from the maximum? In other words, if you start off with, putting it in simple terms, if you've got a litre jug, once you've filled it to more than a litre, you're overflowing. If you're less than a litre, you've still got that bit left. So the capacity is being used in a different sense, I think, in this. Is it? Am I right or not?
But they are two different measures, yes.
So what is the actual meaning of capacity in that fourth line or third from the right?
The meaning is the amount of plasma that can be fractionated.
Can be fractionated.
Can be fractionated.
And so that differs each year?
Well, the...
But it's still, is that not the example of the litre jug, which that's the amount you can deal with?
I'm not sure that is an analogy which fits, because the capacity of a litre jug is defined. It's simple. It is 1 litre.
Yeah, but then the question rises, if that varies, the capacity for plasma, why does the capacity, in the sense of the maximum you can make, not differ with it in terms of international units? Because if for instance, the machinery breaks down, then obviously you can't then make material from the plasma which you've got. And your capacity, measured across the year, has dropped. So I can see there's space for capacity, meaning the maximum you can do, if it means that, varying. But those two columns seem to be saying rather different things.
Well, there are a couple of points to make there, sir. The first is that they are different measures. If all things were equal, one would expect that the amount that BPL and PFL could send out in terms of international units would correlate very closely with the amount that it could fractionate.
No, because the amount it could send out depends on how much goes in. The amount it can fractionate depends on what you can actually make if you're at full tilt.
I think that's what I was trying to say. So one would expect a correlation between the fourth and fifth columns because all other things being equal, if the plant can handle more plasma, then it should be able to handle the production of more factor VIII. So one would expect that correlation.
Yes.
There are points when there is a divergence that we can explain. And perhaps, actually, I'll take you to an example of that, which is, if we could go, please, Paul, to page 41. And this is to do with heat treatment. And if we look at that fourth column along, so that is the amount of plasma that, in theory, or in actuality, BPL and PFL can fractionate, the capacity. And that is 150,000 kilograms across these 3 years. The next column is the capacity as measured by output of the international units, and that starts at 30 million, and that's the figure that we get to at the end of a stopgap programme, but it drops in 1985 and 86 to 24 million. And the reason for that is that there is a decline in yield from each kilogram of plasma that is provided to BPL and PFL because of the heat treatment programme. So you fractionate the same amount of plasma, but you get less product at the end of it. That is why you get the drop down. So that is an example of where the two differ, and we can explain it, or at least we think we can explain it. The harder question is, in the 70s, and in particular in the 1980s, there is a divergence. If we go to page 39, please. It's particularly pronounced between 1978 and 1979. And there we can see that the figure given for the capacity as measured by international units is static. It's 15 million, based upon what Dr. Maycock said and what various other people said at meetings. This is how much BPL and PFL can produce at this time. Whereas the figures that we have obtained for the data for the plasma capacity increase in that time. Now, that is an example of a lack of correlation that we cannot readily explain. It may be that it is simply a quirk of the data, and in the 70s in particular, the data points are tricky. It may be that if we look at our source for the figure for 1978, that is, actually both sources are from 1978 and 1979. Both are taken from Dr. Lane's draft proof of evidence, Appendix 4. But as we saw in the instructions to Counsel, there's a reference to the fact that figures can be inconsistent and that they're taken from a variety of sources. So it may just be a reflection of the fact that we have poor quality data at that time. An alternative is that there is something going on within the production plant that is causing this differential. And we cannot identify what that is in 1978 to 1979. A little later, there is certainly, and possibly even as early as 1979, there's certainly some disruption which we picked up from the evidence, and is set out in Appendix 1, where we can see that there is disruption to supply which results from some of the works that the stopgap programme involving. So there is a reduction of the efficiency of the plant, if one puts it in those terms. But I cannot tell you why those figures in 78 and 79 diverge so dramatically from the international unit figures. Our best understanding of this period in terms of how much BPL and PFL could produce is, I think, reflected in the penultimate column, the international units, which is the production level, the production capacity in this period was fairly static. And we say that because there has been an increase after the £500,000 investment in the new equipment that BPL got at that, after that. But we are not aware of anything else that is done from that period 75 to 79, which would increase the capacity of the plant significantly. It's not until stopgap that you get the further increase.
Can I try to summarise this? I'm just trying to understand really what the documents are saying to me, and I hope the discussion is helpful to those who may be listening, who may also have some questions about it. I think the starting point for me is, first of all, the data is uncertain and has to be approached with not only caution, but probably a very great degree of caution. Secondly, from what you've just said, it may be that if we think of the manufacturing process in the terms of warehousing in advance, on the one hand, and the ability of the production facility to make as stage two, then the ability of the production machinery to make remains exactly the same every year, 96, 76 to 79. But there may be a problem, as you've identified, with something going on at the plant, as you put it, with the end which warehouses the refrigeration equipment or whatever it is that warehouses the fresh frozen plasma when it comes in. Because if you haven't got the freezer working, then you can't take stuff into it. You can still make just as much if you had the stuff, but you don't have the stuff. So I can see that might be a way of looking at it which would could reconcile the figures, but we don't know if it does. Is that a fair summary of what this discussion has led to?
Yes, I think it is, sir. But the one point that I would add for your consideration as well is that the annual data points that we have selected leads to a rather kind of jagged line, 78 to 79 to 80. Actually, in reality, at some point between 1979 and 1982, various improvements were made to BPL, which led to an increase which is perhaps not reflected by those simple annual figures. And it may be that at some point in 1979, as part of the stopgap programme, something was done which allowed for a greater capacity to fractionate plasma, which is reflected in that increase there. But we haven't carried that over in the next column because our assessment of the output in terms of international units is that it increased to 30 million as of November 1982 when stopgap finished. So there's a degree of artificiality in terms of the points that we have chosen, and that may also have an impact. But I'm afraid that we can't be certain of any of those points.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
If we could go, please, to page 7. This is a graphical representation of those figures that we have just looked at for 1973 to 1977. And here you can see the straight lines are very pronounced, but they shouldn't mislead us into thinking that there is linear growth in this time. It's just the nature of the data means that those crude lines will be drawn, particularly if one looks at annual capacity in the right-hand graph, graph 1b. We have a figure at 1973, we have a figure at 1976. They are joined by a straight line, but in reality, it wouldn't have been a perfect straight linear growth in capacity during that time. But what the graphs can helpfully show is that if one looks at graph 1b, the green line showing total factor 8 issued between 1973 and 1977 is below the yellow line showing annual capacity after 1973. And although we must be careful about that yellow line, the general trend that we can discern is that BPL and PFL are not operating to their capacity at that time, and the likely reason for that is a lack of plasma supply. We can see that on graph 1A. That the annual fractionation capacity, the yellow line, is above the red line, which is showing the fresh frozen plasma received. And the fresh frozen plasma fractionated lags behind that as well. The lines get closer as we move into 1977. And then if we go over, please, to if we could just quickly go to page 13, and we'll just take the story up to 1978. On the right-hand graph, you can see there that the lines have closed in 1978 and 1979. That is because, in our assessment, the plasma supply has increased as a result of that £500,000 investment of special allocation. And it has meant that although the capacity of BPL has also increased, BPL and PFL are able to operate at that capacity of around 15 million international units in the late 70s. If we go back now to the figures, and page 39, please. And this is the period where we have this strange quirk between the capacity figures as measured by capacity of fractionation of plasma and annual output of international units. So I won't go into that again. But we can see that the figures for fresh frozen plasma received begin to plateau between 1977, 1978 and 1979. Then over onto page, the next page, please, page 40. The figure there is 85,940 kilograms, so about 86,000, up from 77,000. Then the next figure is 116,000 kilograms, and then the next figure, 148,000 kilograms. So the plasma supply, having leveled off, then picks up again in the early 1980s, and that may well be associated with the pro rata distribution scheme and the single plasma packs that were introduced at around those times. In terms of product issued, 78 and 79, if we could go back a page, please, Paul. The figure there is, thank you. The previous page, page 39. That's it, yep. The figure goes from 11.5 million to just over 14 million, and then a little higher, but still in the range of 14 million between 1977 and 1979. So BPL is approaching capacity in that period. It's unlikely that a plant is ever going to operate exactly at capacity, so it is pretty much at capacity in the late 70s. And if we could go over, please, to 1980, and then 1981 and 1982. So the first figure is for 1980, the second figure is 1981 to 82, and the third figure is 1982 to 83. We can see the difference between the measures of the annual reports. So a slight concern about whether or not we are measuring like with like, whether each one of those is a 12-month period. So wary of that point, I think it is still valid to say that there is a significant increase in the amount of product issued from 11.8 million international units in 1980 to a figure of 21.5 million international units in the year 81 to 82, and a similar figure, 22.6 million international units in 82 to 83. And that increase is one that is associated with stopgap, and the completion of stopgap at the end of November 1982. If we just go on to the next page, please, we can see 1984. BPL and PFL, again, approaching capacity in 1984, getting close to about 30 million international unit mark. So stopgap allows for an increase. And the stopgap program is completed in November 1982. By the year of 1984, capacity is again being reached. I won't take you to the graphs there. If we go over, please, to page, actually stay on this page, on 41. This is the point that we have just been discussing, so the decrease in capacity as measured by international units is a consequence of the heat treatment, and that is why the amount of product issued also declines, whereas the capacity in terms of how much the plant can fractionate of plasma remains the same. It's 150,000 kilograms. That is in the old BPL plant. The new one is being built alongside. If we go over the page, please, to page 42, we can see there the effect of the new BPL. So the capacity to fractionate plasma has gone up to 450,000 kilograms per year, which is the figure that I mentioned earlier today. As measured of output of international units per year, it's up to 60 million. That's from 1987 to 1988. The actual amount issued that year is about 25 million international units, and that is, as I indicated earlier, so because there is a period where it takes BPL to get up to full speed, and we can see 1988 to 1989, it is pretty much at capacity at 57 million international units for that year. If we could just go to page 25, the graphs associated with that last period. If we could have graph 3A. You can see there that between about 1984 and 1987 to 1988, more fresh frozen plasma is being received at BPL than the plant is able to fractionate. That excess is being stockpiled at BPL in order to be fractionated later once the redevelopment is completed.
I suppose that also may be a reason, going back to the earlier discussion we were having about the difference between the ability to take in plasma, assuming that it's the warehousing end at the start, the refrigeration end. If a lot of plasma has come in more than is actually being fractionated, or more than can be fractionated, then it'll stack up.
Yes.
And that will give less space for what's due to come in. So that might be
Yes.
a simpler reason still.
Yes.
For explaining why it is that the capacity to handle plasma, maybe, i.e. to receive it, assuming that's what capacity means for these purposes, if it does, then that will be an explanation too.
It could well be so, yes. One further point I would make from graph A as well, is that we can see that during this period from 1983, there is an increase in the amount of fresh frozen plasma which is being provided to BPL in these years. And it is a significant increase as well. I'll read the figures rather than take you back to them. But from that first column in the tables, in 1984, about 175,000 kilograms of fresh frozen plasma are provided to BPL and PFL. In 1985 to 86, it is up to 250,000 kilograms. In 1986 to 1987, it is a little over 300,000 kilograms. In 1987 to 98, it's up to 375,000 kilograms. And this was part of a wider program to increase plasma supply to BPL and PFL in this period. It was a source of concern, and I think that you have seen some of the documents about that in the blood services hearings, where essentially the DHS was saying, we're building this new plant, we must make sure that we've got enough plasma to actually use it. There were concerns that that wasn't going to be achieved, but we can see from those figures that actually there is a significant increase in plasma supply. And one of the key reasons for that is the introduction of SAG-M, the additive solution, which is discussed in Appendix 6. I'm not going to go through that in detail. The short point is that SAG-M is an additive which can be added to red cell concentrates to make them less viscous and to improve their flow. And that in turn makes those red cell concentrates more attractive to clinicians, and it allows for more plasma to be obtained from a whole blood donation. The figure, or various figures are given for how much can be taken using SAG-M. The sources are set out in Appendix 6. One figure given by Dr. Lane and Mr. Pettit of BPL is 290 millilitres. Dr. Gunson gives a figure of 275 millilitres. Whichever one is more accurate, it is well above the 190 millilitres that could be obtained, which form the basis of previous planning assumptions. SAG-M begins to be used in England and Wales in about 1984. There is considerable regional variation. Funding is an issue, as ever. There is also an issue about the different approaches of different clinicians to the red cell concentrates with SAG-M in them. Some regions enthusiastically adopt SAG-M, especially because it's a cheaper way of increasing plasma supply than plasmapheresis. I will take you briefly to two graphs. One is INQY 40335, page 14. And this is from Annex 6. and it shows the percentage of plasma arriving at BPL having been separated using SAG-M. And we can see it's 0 in 1982, a small increase in 1984, and then a dramatic increase in 1985, and then a more modest increase from 85 onwards. The relevant figures from the table, if we leave the graph up there, I'll just read out the figures from the table. In 1984, it was about 8% of the plasma arriving at BPL had been the result of SAG-M usage. By 1985, that's up to 55%. 1987, 60%. 1988, 68%. And 1989, 75%. I should add, there was never an intention to reach 100%. There was always an acceptance that there was going to be a need for some whole blood. But there are significant increases in the amount of plasma received at BPL to which SAG-M had contributed. Then if we could go, please, to NHBT 001 7097. This is an article from the November 1986 edition of Health Trends, and it is, if we go over to the next page, please, an article written by Dr. Gunson about trends in blood transfusion practice in England and Wales. And if we could go to page 4, please. If we could expand the graph on the right-hand side. This is Dr. Gunson's graph showing the changing pattern of methods for fresh plasma collection in England and Wales using 3 monthly statistics from 1983 to 1985. The SAG-M line is the one with the solid dot, and we can see, as with the previous graph that we have looked at, that rises dramatically from 1985. The top line at the start of this period in 1983, with the dot which isn't coloured in the middle, that is the single plasma pack that we were discussing yesterday. And you will see that as SAG-M increases, the use of the single plasma pack decreases significantly. The reason for that is that the single plasma pack that we were discussing yesterday wasn't big enough to hold the increased amount of plasma that SAG-M allowed for. So it is not used so much, its usage falls away, and instead SAG-M becomes the dominant means of providing blood to BPL. It shouldn't be thought, though, that SAG-M is different in the sense of being a pooled product. It's still a single donor product. It's just reached in a different way. The next line down from the start are the 5-litre plasma packs, the old plasma packs that Dr. Lane was keen on getting rid of, and you can see that there is a fairly stubborn line which remains. There's a slight decline, but not a great decline. And at the bottom, interestingly, is plasmapheresis. And we can see that in this period, 1983 to 1985, there is a slight increase in the amount of fresh plasma collected with plasmapheresis, but it is not a particularly marked increase, and it is a method of collection which is still far below SAG-M and indeed the other methods of collection as well. And the success of SAG-M in increasing plasma supply helps to explain why it is that plasmapheresis is not more used in England and Wales in this period. One final point on this, and it's in Appendix 6, paragraph 28. Dr. Lane told a meeting of the CBLA on the 25th of March 1986 that the plasma supply, to BPL was satisfactory, and he commented in particular, and I quote, the effectiveness of the SAG programme was particularly relevant. So Dr. Lane clearly seeing SAG-M as a reason why the plasma supply, which had been a source of such concern for everybody earlier in the 80s, was not as much of a concern by 1986. I will briefly bring up the bar charts. I'm conscious of the time, but I have just a few minutes left, and I think it may be easier to finish now and allow the transfer of the databases before Ms. Richards' presentation. IMQY 40336, page 42, please. This is the bar chart again, and as I've said, indicative rather than precise. But we can see in that late 80s period the decline of NHS factor rate between 84 and 85 as a result of heat treatment, and then the expansion as a result of the redevelopment of BPL, and from 1989, a reduction in the amount of commercial concentrate that is provided. The reduction may have started between 87 to 88, but it becomes more pronounced 88 to 89. Cryoprecipitate by this time making up very little of the usage in the United Kingdom. So that is the overall picture. Those last two bar charts, though, do still show the use of commercial concentrate within the United Kingdom. If we could go, please, to NHBT 0103463_009. This is a press release from the 2nd of December 1988, dealing with the production at the Blood Products Laboratory reaching record levels, so a DHSS press release. And it refers to an answer given to a written parliamentary question by Edwina Currie, then the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health. And it quotes the answer that she gave that day. It says, and I quote, "The £60 million Blood Products Laboratory is now producing factor VIII at record levels, but it is not yet possible to predict when we shall no longer need to import factor VIII. Yields so far are lower than expected, though higher than the commercial producers, and a reappraisal of the buffer stock of plasma has shown it to be less than previously thought." I pause there to say I think that is a reference to a miscalculation that was made in the 1980s about how much plasma had been stockpiled. Back to the quotation. "Action is being taken by the Central Blood Laboratories Authority to increase yields and by the Blood Transfusion Service to increase the collection of plasma, which will lead to higher output over the next 3 years." Mrs. Currie later said, "The government's aim is to meet the needs of haemophiliacs in England and Wales from home-produced factor VIII. To this end, the government have invested nearly £60 million in a new plasma fractionation plant at Elstree. This new blood products laboratory, BPL, is now producing factor VIII at record levels. Over the year 1989 to 1990, as a whole, BPL expect to make a record 65 million, sorry, is it 55 million or 65 million? Can we just expand that bottom paragraph? It's 65 million. BPL expect to make a record 65 million international units of factor VIII. This represents around 70% of our present requirement. The balance will be imported, as now, under very stringent quality controls. It is necessary to stress that all imported products are licensed under the Medicines Act, and the need to use imported products does not put haemophiliacs at any greater risk." I think that is the end of the document. Oh, no, sorry, over to the next stage. "We will, contrary to earlier expectations, still need to import factor VIII for the time being. We are disappointed that our previous hopes for self-sufficiency will not be realised. The new BPL represents a massive exercise in scaling up from production in the old plant. Yields at this stage are lower than those previously achieved and on which earlier forecasts of production were based. I pause there to note, sir, that the impact of heat treatment is notable on the yield. Because yields are lower, we need to process more plasma to achieve the same level of output. Plasma collection is already at record levels. However, the newly created National Directorate for the Blood Transfusion Service are making achievement of even higher levels of plasma collection a priority task and are discussing with regional transfusion directors how this can be achieved. By taking concerted action on both production yields and plasma supply, we expect significantly to increase production of factor VIII over the next 3 years. And in the meantime, haemophiliacs can be reassured that the supply of factor VIII to them will be maintained. And that's the end of the press release from Ms. Curry, or Mrs. Curry, I think it was. One final document, DHSC 30466936_009. This is from the 25th of October 1990, so slightly later, and it is a briefing sheet for the Secretary of State in anticipation of a parliamentary question. And the title is Self-Sufficiency Factor VIII. The line to take. Estimates made in the mid-1970s of the amount of factor VIII required to achieve self-sufficiency did not anticipate the increased demand for this treatment. It was this administration's commitment to redevelop the Blood Products Laboratory in 1981 which enabled us to meet the clinical demand for our product. So that is the line that is being advised. The background note says this. Dr. David Owen made a commitment in January 1975 to NHS self-sufficiency in the production of factor VIII, the target expected to be reached in mid-1977 and funded with an extra £0.5 million. Between 1975 and 1977, NHS production increased from 3.2 million units per annum to 12.8 million in 1977, but total demand increased from 8.2 to 27.4 million units in the same period, so that the proportion of commercial product remained the same. Between 1980 and 1982, ministers approved the spending of £2 million on upgrading the original plant at Elstree. That's the stopgap. In 1981, ministers agreed to the redevelopment of BPL. The design capacity for this was around 100 million international units of factor VIII. Current position on self-sufficiency. BPL are now meeting 75% of the total requirement for factor VIII of about 110 million international units per year. Clearly, BPL want to maximise use of their products, but the decision on which product is best for the patient rests with the clinician. Absolute self-sufficiency is likely to be unattainable given the clinician's freedom to prescribe. The policy now is one of meeting the clinical demand for home-produced factor VIII. BPL are able to meet such demand. The recent EC directive on blood products promotes the idea of community self-sufficiency. This too is a factor which points away from being able to achieve sole use of the BPL product. And that, sir, is where the policy had reached by 1990. I take that to mean that the policy has changed from being one where NHS products would completely replace commercial products to one where the goal is that whenever a clinician in the United Kingdom seeks to use a domestically produced product, then that product would be available to the clinician. But it doesn't prohibit the clinician from using imported products if the clinician chose to do so. And that, sir, is where we take our leave of domestic production and self-sufficiency in terms of a chronological presentation, and we move to the individual presentations for Dr. Smith first and then Dr. Lane, which will be given by Ms. Richards.
Yes, so Dr. Smith at 2:15. The presentation about Dr. Smith,
Yes.
2:15.